Okay. So recording has started. This is the training for Indicator 2 for SUD. There are two aspects that we record in Indicator 2. The first is Indicator 2B, and that is the time that it takes a client to get to their first treatment service between the time that they first call, their request date, and the date of first service. They're typically their first face-to-face encounter. Used to be the assessment, but it can be any reportable service now with Indicator 2. There's also 2E, which is the number of clients who are expected to be at an intake appointment, but they never show, or expected to be at a first service, but they never show. So the highlights from the state's code book, that request date is the very first time that somebody calls Access and makes a request for service. This is either walk-in or telephone call. The request starts the very first time you are able to identify that client in the electronic health record. So if there's a missed call, say, for example, a client calls on January 1st, Access calls the person back on January 1st, but they don't pick up. Access calls, leaves a message, and then they call back on 1/15. That initial request date is still January 1st. So I will also say Access has the most important job when recording this initial request date, because Access is really the only entity that can see all of the calls. A provider can't see if somebody called Access previously, how many times they called, what was the first date they called. Access is the only entity that can see that. So it's very important that Access is recording the correct request date for Indicator 2B, and also if they expire, Indicator 2E. If a client is coming from a residential facility, going to the next level of care or the next facility, that is typically done and calculated by either the PIHP or the CMH that holds the contract, either Lenawee, Livingston, or us at CMH PSM, through the utilization review process in a concurrent review. So typically, if a client is stepping down from residential care going to the next level, the discharge date from that residential episode becomes the date of the request for the new wrapper. And so, like I said, Access typically isn't going to perform this function unless it's an Access staff member at Livingston or Lenawee who also does concurrent reviews and step downs from previous levels of care. So a new request versus a continuation of an existing request. If a person does not receive any subsequent services following an initial request and they call again, it's considered a new request, or they would need a new wrapper only if it has been more than 60 days since that very first phone call or first request. So here in this scenario, there are only two reportable requests, the initial one on January 1st and a second one on March 5th. The one on 2/1 doesn't count as a reportable request because it's still within 60 days of that very first initial request. So we'll go through this step by step. If someone calls on January 1st, they were scheduled for a service on January 3rd, but they canceled that appointment. February 1st, they called back and said, no, really, I want to go to treatment. This is considered the same request as the January 1st. So the wrapper would be updated if they wanted to go somewhere else, or any other situation, we would still use that same wrapper that is already in Cricut. We would just make amendments, not amending the request date, making amendments in the notes section that says client called back, didn't attend the appointment or canceled the appointment on January 3rd, is now requesting a different appointment. So if they're scheduled then on February 3rd, that provider would still see and use that first wrapper for that February 3rd service, and it would still show the very first request date of January 1st. If they no-call, no-showed or canceled the February 3rd appointment and called back on March 1st, because it is more than 60 days after January 1st, this third call is a new wrapper. It's a second wrapper. This old wrapper still stays in the system and it gets reported to the state as an expired request automatically. And then the client gets their first service March 11th. That intake or that admission that the treatment provider puts in is going to be in that second wrapper above the one that has expired. Basically an empty wrapper, you're just going to see a link to add an SUD admission, and that means nothing happened with that appointment. Are there questions so far? So cases that are included in 2B are all approved requests. Before, the state was only including cases where clients were admitted to treatment. They had an SUD admission. So we were losing all the people who requested service and never received a service. In this new version, we're still calling it new because it's the newest. In the newest version, the state is still collecting the state is collecting all approved requests, whether they go on to receive a service or not. A request is approved if they are screened and expected at a treatment provider for the first service. If the request is not followed by a first service or an SUD admission, it goes to the state as expired. So like we talked about in this scenario here, this first call on January 1st, this first request never resulted in an appointment that a client attended. So this is going to the state on day 60 as expired. So if there are wrappers in there that if there are too many, we're sending too many requests. And then if you delete wrappers that have no admission, that truly were a request, we're not sending enough. So it's important that the wrappers reflect this flow of requests and expirations. Before, the state would allow us to exclude or accept a client from the indicator if it was the client's choice to not attend an appointment within the expected time frame. They don't let us do that anymore. So there are times where a client might call on January 1st. They get scheduled for an appointment on January 7th. They miss that appointment. And then they choose a different provider and say they are scheduled for January 15th. When that happens, it's already out of compliance, already over 14 days. So there's really not much we can do. It's just that's how long it took that person to get in, even though it was their choice. So we would ask for notes in the wrapper. For any reason, a client calls back and changes their mind, or a client misses an appointment. And if you're handling that case, we would ask that any notes, if it's related to that request, go into the notes field of the wrapper. So there is a time to treatment field in the BH-TEDS on the SUD admission. And again, that SUD admission is done by the provider, but the provider is not able to amend that field. That field is automatically calculated based on the request date in the wrapper and the admission or first service date on that SUD admission at the treatment provider. So in the above scenario, that second request on 3.5, which was the brand new request, would go to the state when the provider does their SUD admission on 3.11. That BH-TEDS field on the SUD admission is already populating to 6 because it took 6 days from March 5th to March 11th for that person to receive that first service. It's in the 14-day window. And we're still in a period where they're kind of getting a baseline or a threshold for what the date or the number of days is that they would like to see. They're still kind of figuring that out. So we don't really necessarily have a threshold of 14 days, but that's what we shoot for because that's what has always been, and we haven't been told differently yet.
Joellen, can I pop in for a second?
Absolutely.
A couple things. First, one thing that I notice in the data sometimes is that if somebody if there's a typo and Access goes in and is like, just kidding, the request date, I put the wrong thing in, I have to go fix that. Because the BH-TEDS automatically calculates the time to treatment, it has to be unlocked and then locked again in order for that calculation to update. So sometimes, even though Access has fixed the request date, it still goes to the state wrong. The BH-TEDS has to be unlocked and locked. I hope everybody knows what that means, the unlocked thing. Anyway, then the other thing is,
But wait, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Because the SUD admission is authored by an SUD provider, I would need Access to either alert me or the author of that SUD admission at the treatment provider in order to unlock that BH-TEDS record. So if you make any changes to the request date after an SUD admission has been added, you would need to contact your Cricket liaison, either Diane, Wendy, or myself in order to unlock that BH-TEDS document or the original author of that SUD admission at the provider.
Yes, really good point. Didn't think about that. The other thing is, I'm positive that it's 14 days. It's going to be 14 days.
Okay.
The thing that's not positive is what % of cases have got to be within 14 days. It used to be 95% have to be, but now that's the thing that's variable. But it's going to stay 14.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
That's helpful. All right, so this is what that wrapper looks like. Thank you, Jessica. They used to be a little bit more complicated. There were checkboxes, there were drop downs and fields that are no longer there. So we simplified the wrapper and we only have information there that we are reporting now because there was all that stuff that we were reporting an indicator to previously. We don't report exceptions, we don't report exclusions. So those things, if you look at a wrapper prior to, I think it was April 1st of 2020, they might look a little different. So we have the affiliate, which will populate based on the affiliate that you're logged into, which is required. Assessed by is the treatment center who is providing that face-to-face assessment or intake, and then SUD treatment agency. There are going to be very, very, very few times that these providers are going to be different because all counties are performing Access the same way. Everybody goes through their CMH access point. Assessed by an SUD treatment agency are most of the time going to be the same thing. There might be a time where, say somebody from MDOC calls, they don't meet criteria for treatment in the screening, they still have to be referred on for a face-to-face assessment. So it could be that they go to Catholic Charities for an assessment, and during that assessment, it's revealed that actually, yeah, this person does need residential treatment. So they may have to go on somewhere else to receive that SUD treatment. So SUD treatment agency might be different somewhere like Sacred Heart. So anybody in these fields will have access to this wrapper. So make sure when you're choosing the in the drop down, the correct agencies. There are a couple different Catholic charities. There's one in Livingston, one in Lenawee, one in Monroe, and there's Catholic Social Services in Ann Arbor. So make sure you're choosing the right agencies. If you choose in the assessed by field an agency that you're not referring to, when the provider goes to look up this client, they're not going to have the wrapper in order to add their SUD admission. So it's important that you're choosing the right provider. There are different sites at providers as well. So the SUD admission, the location of the SUD admission pre-populates based on this assessed by field. So there are times that a client might get to a location and they might go, say they're going up to Bear River Center Street. That's where the referral was made, but actually they don't need detox, so they're just going straight to Gaylord. We can change that, but we need to make sure that we change it before they do the SUD admission. Otherwise, that SUD admission will populate as the incorrect location. And then the request date is that very first time the person requested services, whether or not that's the same day that they're referred. It might be that they're referred on a different day. You played phone tag for a couple days, or client made their decision where they wanted to go a day after. So this request date is that very first call, that super important date that we've been talking about. And then any notes here in the notes field. After you've completed this wrapper, you would just click save. Like I said, Access does not complete the SUD admission, and Access does not create a referral form. So once you click save, it'll be there under SUD treatment episodes in the electronic health record in Cricut. So again, making sure the time to treatment in BH TEDS field is correct. Only Access can enter wrappers. Since CMH Access departments have a bird's eye view of the situation, they are the only ones who really know the consumer's true request date. Before, providers were able to enter their own wrappers and put their own request date in there. Because they don't really know, we took that function away from providers, and Access is the only entity that can enter a new wrapper. The only exception is when somebody is transferring from one level of care to the next within that same treatment provider. So after a discharge, the screen will show this link to transfer consumer to the right, where the provider can enter a new wrapper at their own site. So the request date of the new wrapper becomes the discharge date of the previous level of care, and it automatically populates into the new wrapper. So in this case, a client was at Higuera Oakdale for detox or withdrawal management. They admitted on March 3rd, discharged on March 4th, and they're stepping down right to residential. So when Oakdale puts in their SUD discharge, this link pops up, they click it, the new wrapper is created, and they cannot change this request date. It's automatically populated based on the discharge date from the previous level. And then when they click save, then they can add in their SUD admission for residential. Are there questions so far?
Joellen, I have a question that goes back a little bit. When you were talking about requests for service, what in the case of Salvation Army, where they may admit somebody for detox on the weekend or after hours, and when they call the next day, to ask for the detox off, the request for service date would be the day that they enter detox, correct?
The request for service would be the very first time they called Salvation Army to say, I want to come to detox. So if they just walked in, then yes. If they called the day before, like say they called on Friday at 6 o'clock and they admitted on Saturday at 9 a.m., that Friday is the request date.
Okay,
The very first time they called anywhere. So when you're talking to Salvation Army and they say this client came in on Saturday, you would ask them, did they call prior to Saturday, or was that the initial request?
okay, that's something I'm not doing that we need to start doing.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
sure. So until now, like I said before, the SUD admission date was the intake date. However, it is the first time anybody receives a face-to-face encounterable service. We don't do the brief screening H0002. So it might be the intake date, but it doesn't have to be. For instance, if somebody is scheduled for an intake on January 4th at Catholic Charities in Livingston, but they attend an engagement group on January 2nd, January 2nd is going to be the intake or SUD admission date. So there's not many times Access is going to need to sort this out. That's typically done by the utilization management departments. So unless Livingston or Lenawee Access is also doing the concurrent reviews and checking this indicator, there's not really a time where Access will monitor this, but this is what we're looking at when Wendy, Diane, and I go in to look at the indicators. This is where we're calculating. The very first time anybody receives a service is that admission date. And like I said before, that is auto-calculated by Cricut. This is the field on the SUD admission that shows the time to treatment. So this is based on that very first date that Access puts in the wrapper. So that's why it's super important to make sure that that's the correct date in that field on the wrapper. And like Jessica said before, if either the SUD admission date or the request date changes, the BHTEDS will need to be unlocked. So contact your Cricut liaison or the original author of that SUD admission at the treatment provider in order for that to be recalculated in the BHTEDS information that we send to the state. So making sure all approved requests are reported, even the ones with no first service. So every approved request needs to be entered in a wrapper. Should be done at the same time that you authorize services, because when you authorize services is when you decide that that's an approved request. So if a consumer calls on January 1st, but no assessment is scheduled, calls back on January 5th, again, nothing is scheduled, calls back on January 15th, that's when they're screened and referred to treatment. The wrapper is entered on January 15th, but the request date is January 1st. Because there was never an authorization or a referral prior to January 15th, January 1st is that initial request, and the wrapper, unfortunately, will go to a provider already out of compliance, but that's where you're going to put notes in. Called on the 1st, there was, and then called on the 1st, we weren't able to screen. We called back on January 5th. Client was not available. Client called back on January 15th, was screened, and that's why it's over 14 days. The consumer may or may not end up getting that assessment, but the request must be documented in the wrapper because we are able to verify the request dates directly in Cricut. we are making sure that those requests, the initial request date is actually the initial very first time that the person called. So I do for Monroe, and I will do for Washtenaw, a report that shows up, that shows me the dates on wrappers that look like they might be wrong based on the information that's in Cricut. So I will send those cases back and say, look at these cases, make sure that these request dates are correct at the end of the quarter. And then that's when we look and monitor and clean this stuff up. Wendy does it for Lenoy, and I believe Diane does it for Livingston. And then, so like I said before, a wrapper is valid for 60 days. After 60 days, that wrapper expires. When a provider goes to enter in an SUD admission, they won't be able to enter the admission if it's been 60 days since that initial request. This is the error that they're going to get when they go to enter in an SUD admission into a wrapper that has expired. The system won't let them do it. The request date plus 60 is the error that they get. So if this happens, the client should be rescreened. There should be a new request or a new wrapper entered by Access, unless it happened that, so this is going to get confusing. So stay with me, ask questions if you need to. If the consumer calls, oh, we're not confusing yet. So if the consumer calls and it's been more than 60 days, Access will enter a new wrapper. So it's clear cut. It's been 60 days, that request expires. Consumer calls Access all over again, and the process starts with a new wrapper. That initial wrapper expires and is sent to the state automatically. So leave those in if they are actual requests, and then just create a new wrapper, first one, if the first one has expired. There is a chance where, or an instance where a client calls and it's within that 60-day window, but the first service is scheduled outside of that window. So say someone calls on January 1st, they don't make their appointment on January 3rd, they call back on the 1st of February and say, I really want to go. So they're scheduled for February 3rd. That's it. Still the same request in the same wrapper. They, for some reason, don't show that appointment on February 3rd. They call back on the 28th. Because this call is within the 60 days, but if they are scheduled for a service on March 11th, that is without or outside of the 60 days. So the system wouldn't let that provider enter the SUD admission because it's been 60 days. But when they called, it was within the 60 days. Anybody not with me? Do I need to go through that again? There is a button on the wrapper that only Access has access to. So there's a little checkbox to add an extension for 14 days to that expired wrapper. So when you click on a wrapper that has expired, and the provider is going to need to call Access to do this, and we put it in the hands of Access because Access is the only one that can see and validate that this is an instance where the person called within 60 days. It's just that their appointment happened within that first, or outside of that first 60 days. So the link is to the right of the wrapper. When you click on SUD treatment episodes, this automatically populates anyway. We set it to show all wrappers. But if for some reason you can't see it and this box isn't checked, click that checkbox and search. All wrappers that have expired will show up, and you're going to click this link that says override expiration date. This link allows access to extend that wrapper for 14 days beyond the standard 60 days. We ask that you put the notes in the notes section to include the date that the consumer called to make sure that this date is within 60 days of that initial request, because this is the only reason anybody should ever extend a wrapper. So we want to make sure that we have record of the dates and why that wrapper was extended. So this warning box pops up. Normally a request is valid for 60 days. If the consumer made an appointment within 60 days of the request to be admitted and no other request has been made since then, check the box to allow to extend the request. So you check this checkbox and then put your notes in. Consumer called 2/28, scheduled their intake for 3/11, need to extend the expiration past 3/1 so that provider can enter the SUD admission. If you do this process and the client does not attend the appointment on 3/11, this will automatically expire after that 14 days. But if for some reason you need to undo that extension, if the client calls back, say on the 5th, well, no, that wouldn't happen. If for some reason you need to undo it, you can uncheck this checkbox. You can change it after the fact. So just to undo it, just uncheck the box that says allow this request to be valid for an additional 14 days beyond the standard 60. So that part gets a little confusing, but if Access needs to do it, Access is the only entity that can. Providers can't extend.
Joellen?
Yeah.
This is Andrea. I just have just want to find out if this scenario would also apply to this situation. So if the caller called, let's say in the middle of that month,
Mm-hmm.
the last month, so like the 45th day, and they asked for that service, but they didn't come into an appointment for an intake until the 61st day, would we extend or do a new screen?
That would be an extension of the same wrapper because they requested on day 45. If they were scheduled on day 61, then that would be an extension. If they just didn't attend that appointment and called back on day 61 and said, I didn't make my appointment yesterday on day 60, but I still want to go to treatment, that would be a new request.
Okay, thank you.
They have to, if the phone call came in within the 60 days, the wrapper should be extended. If the client calls after day 60, it's a new request. So if they called on day 59 instead of day 45 and said, yeah, I do want to come in, that's an extension of that wrapper.
And you can only extend it once, correct?
Correct. Yep. If they, for some reason, missed this appointment on 3/11, then you would uncheck that checkbox and create a new wrapper. So making sure the 60-day expiration rule is enforced and wrapper overlap. If a consumer makes another request to the same provider within 60 days, it's considered a continuation of that initial call. So a second wrapper would not be entered. If staff accidentally try to enter a new wrapper for that request, Cricut's going to say, no, you can't do that. They're going to send an error. So if consumer calls Access on January 1st, referred to Catholic Charities for their first service, Catholic Charities schedules them for a service on January 3rd, but they no-show. Consumer calls again on February 1st to reschedule. So wrapper number 1 was entered with a request date of January 1st. So the Access staff member selected Catholic Charities. The request date is January 1st. Cricut will throw this error that says there is already an open or started episode for this consumer assessment provider and treatment agency. So you can't enter a new wrapper. You would just use this same wrapper, enter a note, enter a request for service, enter a call log, or whatever the local procedure is. It's a little bit different. You just can't enter a second wrapper. It would all be considered the first request with note in the wrapper as to what happened. So there may be a time when it's okay to enter multiple wrappers. So for example, if somebody calls CMH Access on January 1st, from this single call, Access determines that they will need to go to Catholic Charities for Women's Specialty Services, and at the same time, going to Key Development for medication-assisted treatment with Vivitrol. So in this case, 2 wrappers can be entered because the assessed by provider is not the same. There will be no error. So in this case, because the provider was the same, Cricket wouldn't allow it because this wrapper already shows that it was a request. The second wrapper is within that 60 days, so Cricket won't allow it at that same provider. In this case, they're going to 2 different providers for 2 completely different services. So Cricket will allow 2 different wrappers because each treatment agency is going to need to do their own SUT admission in order to report encounters and claims and things like that. Questions about any of this? Okay. So that is the training on the wrappers and on the indicators. I'm going to stop recording and then we're going to have some fun. Let me